Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H virtual event space. You are tuned into another episode of the Passionate Photographer Critiques with the passionate photographer himself, Mr. Steve Simon. Steve, how's it going?
Everything is good. How are things your way?
Things are wonderful.
There.
I'm feeling colorful over here. I just do a little,
Excellent.
little background switch up for the Monday audience. So we got a rainy day here in the city, hoping that we can turn that gloom into some joy with today's photos and critique session.
Yeah, speaking of rainy days, I mean, I don't know about you, Derek, but inclement weather can be uncomfortable to be in, but it's a great time to shoot. It's in,
Mm.
especially in the city, for street photography, the reflections and as an old photojournalist, where oftentimes weather was the story, and you had to go out and kind of capture an image that captured the weather. There are plenty of places to kind of stay comfortable under the cover of something and with a slightly long lens document the misery that inclement weather often brings to people, and it means good pictures.
That's a great point. Nice weather for what most people consider nice weather makes for incredibly boring images.
Yeah, and I love looking at a lot of the work of Saul Leiter, who
Mm.
who used to love going out into the rain and shooting through reflections and so on. And on that front, there's one picture here that I thought, just because we're talking as we are now, we can start with, and that is this image of this woman behind what looks like kind of an inclement weather scenario. I'm just trying to make this a little bit bigger on my Zoom screen. See, there we go. I love this kinds of shooting. I love shooting through, rain and droplets and, through windows and cars and so on and so forth. I'm not the F-64 guy necessarily, whatever works, to make a picture and capture the atmosphere, I think can be successful. And yeah, looking at this one, I think it's kind of nice. It looks as though, and again, the file size is not really that big enough to allow us to kind of zoom in, but you definitely see the woman looks like she's posing behind what looks to be sort of a raindrop lidden window. And I think it works, in terms of creating the atmosphere. I think too, though, that perhaps maybe we don't need it cropped exactly like this. Maybe we could sort of come in a little bit and just sort of fill the frame just a little bit more with her. Maybe a little bit less on the bottom and more on the top. What are your thoughts on this image,
I was just gonna say
Derek?
the same thing. My main gripe was the aspect ratio,
Yeah.
and it looked like it was a 16:9 is a tricky crop when using it vertically, and I feel like it's something that unless there's a purpose, if you have a tall, thin building and 16:9 is the only way you're gonna fit that building into your composition, without with minimizing the distractions, then that's okay. Or obviously, we've gotten used to vertical 16:9 now with phones and posting in Instagram stories and on social media and posting in, we're paying attention to where we're posting, which is a great thing because we want to put it in the aspect ratio that benefits the medium. And for the phone, 16:9 vertical is where it's at. But I do think this looks a lot better. I am not a huge fan of the vignette, but on something like this, I feel like I would want to see a little more attention paid to drawing the viewer's eye into the center of the frame, and a vignette in a non-aggressive way can be a great way to kind of bring the focus inward.
Getting a little aggressive here. I see what you're saying, and from a a very sort of critical. I mean, I love the atmosphere. I kind of like the mood, but I know, having shot these kinds of images as well, the plane of focus is important, and if the glass is flat. It's important, I think, depending on the situation. You can see that the drops are a little bit sharper here. They're kind of a little out of focus there and a little out of focus there. But when it comes to the woman herself, the eyes, as we know, are always something that we like to kind of focus on when it comes to portraits and people. And in this particular instance, I have a feeling that the tilt of the camera is a little bit such that the emphasis seems to be a little more on the hand and the nose area. But when it comes to the eyes are kind of blocked out a little bit by the droplets. And, again, being sort of this, critiquing this in a way, it's not a deal breaker, but the positioning of the eyes in an image like this, I think, is probably first and foremost in terms of making sure that the eyes maybe come through a little bit more than they do in this particular image. Do you think I'm being a little too critical on that?
No, I actually think that's a great point that I initially didn't even think of. And we see it a lot, Steve, when people put up like a hand sign or are holding something up in front of their face, and we're faced with that decision: do we focus on the hand? Do we focus on the face? Because what do we always hear? You connect to the eyes. The eyes should always be in focus. But sometimes what's important is what's being held up, or something like in this case where you have two planes. So yeah, I mean, I look at it and I'll bring it up is something that we don't often consider, is we get so caught up in, okay, well, mirrorless cameras and DSLRs and your quote unquote professional or prosumer cameras are better than phones. This is probably a case where a phone, because of that smaller sensor and that richer depth of field, might be a better choice. Sometimes that shallow depth of field, if you focus on the eyes, then you don't get the strong effect of the raindrops, and it could look like just a dirty or cloudy window. And if you focus too much on the pane of glass and the raindrops, then you fall into that territory where like, okay, well, the face isn't really in focus. And unless you have something dynamic about how it's lit or positioned or the features of it, it gets you kind of caught in a no man's land, so to speak, of where should the focus be. And I think that's something that you see in cell phone shots that are very successful, or point and shoot cameras.
Yeah, that's a very good point. As you know, I do a lot of workshops, and oftentimes students will submit images, and they'll be apologetic if it comes to, oh, this was shot on an iPhone, and they have their reason for it. But ultimately, we don't care the tool that you use. It really doesn't matter. And in the hands of an artist, you're going to take whatever's given to you and you're going to make the most of it. And, as you mentioned, the inherent more depth of field that you get with a phone, I think would work really well here, which isn't to say that you couldn't maybe improve on this. The bar is raised a little bit sometimes when you have more control over what you can do with a more advanced cameras, and the phones are great for so many things. But when it comes to kind of moving things, that's when often we start to see some limitations. But yeah, I mean, again, this is a critique session where, we're all learning from each other and we're learning from the photos. And I think it's important to talk about those things. So I think it was last week we kind of left off. We we didn't really know what was going to happen to this woman, but now we know that she made the bar. She's okay, everybody. Everything is good. But we left off with this kind of a moment of a trapeze artist, obviously on stage. You get a sense, you can see the equipment up there. The moment is particularly important. And, I talk about this a lot. As you can see here, the focus seems to be a little bit maybe toward her bum here, but I'm not really sure if necessarily that matters all that much, because the moment is key, and it's a pretty dramatic one at that, in that you can see the bar is probably swinging. We don't know what's going to happen. That said, it's our job to critique. Would the picture be stronger if the hands were sharpest versus sort of the bottom part of her body? I would argue yes. And I think it's also a combination of movement, but I do feel that the focus, if this is an autofocus shot, which it likely might be, if the focus was more on the hands, even if there was movement, because it's the hands that are sort of really the critical factor. It's the hands that need to make contact with the bar. But but beyond that, her position in the very blue area and the swing and the lighting and so on up there, and even the micro composition of these lines is not hurting it. When we're able to scrutinize and go in close, we can sort of see that. But it's a nice moment, and oftentimes, the moment is more important than some of the technical stuff that's going on.
Yeah, definitely. And we say this all the time that we're not there. We are at a loss because we don't know what the situation was. In a performance like this, we can probably assume with a high probability that you're there, you have a ticket, you can't just get up and wander around and get the best angle or perspective for your photo. So you're at the mercy of that. That being said, it is a critique. Our job is to critique what's presented to us. And sometimes people do present images like this for a contest or for something else where it behooves them to have an honest opinion. So that being said, there's a lot of distraction here for me. I'm not going to beat a dead horse, Steve. You talked about the focus points and the hands, and I think there needs to be a conscious decision made between blur and freezing the motion, where blur can be great, it can be sexy, it can be romantic and add to the feeling and the emotion of an image. But if it's not intentional blur, or if it's not the right kind of blur, it can also be a little bit distracting, because then you start to look at what's in focus, what's not, what's slightly blurry. I have a huge problem with what's going on in the background. And again, you're at the mercy of where you're sitting, but the black objects in the back that kind of are just, you don't know what they are. And again, when you don't know what something is in an image or why it's there, you question it. And any thought that you put into something in the image that isn't the subject or that doesn't play into the efficacy of an image is going to distract from that. The out of focus looks like a cable in the foreground cutting across the left side and cutting across the trapeze. Again, that's a distraction. And I'll say the caveat again that we know that you're at the mercy of where you're at, but that's also where the challenge comes in of creating the best moment possible. And sometimes you have to think outside the box, and sometimes you have to zoom in a little more. Sometimes you actually zoom out a little bit and you don't get so close to the action, because sometimes the more information you have, there might be something else. If this image were zoomed out by 30 millimeters, I'm going to have a lot more environment there. I'm going to be less distracted by, maybe whatever the black thing is behind the trapeze, or the out of focus cable on the lower left corner, because they're going to be, I'll see anchor points. I'll see what they're attached to. I'll look at the scene more as a whole. And whenever I think we talked about this last week, Steve, whenever you crop in and zoom in way tighter, you have less elements to make your point or less elements to distract, which means each and every element that is in the image is that much more important. You have less supporting cast, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. In some ways, I'm a little less critical of, some of the dark areas where you've got the line that crosses the trapeze swing and so on, because it's kind of, working with, some of the other graphic lines of the cables, etc. But your point is well taken. If you zoom out 30 millimeters and include some of that, more of the graphic lines, the ones that are a little bit distracting, like the one that Derek just mentioned by the swing, becomes a little less so and becomes more sort of graphic, and you still have the power of the moment. The reason I'm a little less worried about the distraction is, everything's kind of dark, and she is so lit up in the image that, for me, it's a little less important, but, noted for sure. And the moment is good, the focus is a little off, but it's there. And I think we can leave it at that, because I think the points were well made. But it's a very decisive moment. It would be nice, of course, to maybe see her face, her eyes, to be able to kind of see the expression on her face, the concentration. But that said, we know it's a really important moment that was captured there. So let's move on. And we've got a few images here that I think, have some sort of breathing space. And they also include the chess pieces of humanity and animals. And, we'll talk about them for what they're worth. So in this first image, it's really kind of a beautiful light, a beautiful scene that has been captured here. I love the little point of light that the sun provides, and the haze is making the sun a little diffuse. So it's really kind of saturating the image with this sort of warm golden glow. I love the elements here of, the footprints or the hoof prints, the moments of these animals, kind of and interacting, I guess, with the dog. These two elements are kind of perfect. Here's where, again, it falls apart a little. And again, excuse us, not that Derek or I would have done any better with this scene. But, the fact is that, this particular horse, because it's turned and because it's kind of a silhouette scenario, the shape is not quite as obvious, although you can get a sense of it here. I would have liked maybe the dog to be a little bit further away. That's my only sort of micro critique there. But it really is kind of a beautiful image. I just wish, and believe me, there are so many times when I'm shooting and I'm trying to get that kind of perfection with things that are out of my control, that I'm frustrated and disappointed with the way things turned out. But at the same time, you have to look at the positives of this image, of which there are many. And it's really kind of a beautiful moment, beautiful scene. I can sort of feel what it might be like to be there. And I think that's kind of a compliment for sure when you see an image and you can feel something. So I'll let you talk a little more, Derek, on this.
Totally. Well, Steve, can you humor me with your crop tool for a moment?
Sure.
Because this is something that I want to see it in much tighter. You look at what's in the foreground, and I think a lot of times, even if so crop it down a little bit and just take some of the foreground out and take some of the left out and leave it more of like a.
Do you want me to keep the aspect ratio?
Keep the aspect ratio, drag that bottom left corner up.
All right.
And make it about 2/3 sky. So bring that bottom, just really cut off some of the foreground. And I just want to show people how, and drag that up. There we go. How much?
Okay. How much do you want?
Do you want me to right there? Yeah. For argument's sake, that's good right there.
All right.
And a lot of times, and this, I think this is just the way we see things and how most people, again, see things. And this isn't always going to be the case, but whenever you have less foreground is, think of foreground as something that just absorbs your attention. It draws your eye because there's something there. There's more that's going to be in focus there than a sky. A sky plays the perfect backdrop, figuratively and literally. And if you drag that, keep that same crop right there, and now drag the image to where you have less sky and more foreground. There, like that. Now, what happens is, where's the power of the image? The power of the image is in that top third. But where does your eye want to go? You have these footprints or hoof prints in the foreground. And whether your eye goes there first or second, it's going to go there. Your eye is going to travel there naturally. So pay attention to framing and cropping. So I would remove a lot of the foreground when I shot this, because what are we looking at? There's an element there. Think of it like plating a dish. And what do they always say? Don't put it on the plate unless it can be eaten. Something like that is more like a garnish where, okay, does it add to the image, okay, you have the hoof prints. It does add some kind of context, but you don't need that added. You know that you can see that it's sand or dirt and that horses are running around. There's assumed footprints. Does it really sell it having that extra set down there? I don't think so. Even, and you'll, as you're watching, as I'm talking, watch Steve play around with different crops. And I'm going to guess what you're doing, Steve, is seeing just what feels right
Yeah.
based on what's in the
Yeah.
frame, right?
And I'm also kind of looking at the corners of the frame as well, or sorry, the edges of the frame to see where the cropping might,
Yes.
work the most.
I swear we critique too much. I'm like, inside your head, I can kind of almost see in the way that you're maneuvering this. And what Steve means by that is you can't just slap any old random crop. And this is why seeing in the moment is so important, because rather than taking this in and saying, okay, well, do I have to go in and clone stamp some stuff out, or do I have to labor over cropping? If I see it in real time and I can frame it the way I want it and minimize those distractions in real time, this is time that you don't have to spend in processing. You have a nice sunrise or sunset there. It's a very minimalist backdrop. And look at that right there. Look how much more powerful, where the focus is wholly on the images. The blur.
I think I do think it's powerful like this, but I have to say that my initial kind of thinking was that I kind of like the bottom of the frame, in the sense that, here, let's just try something like this and see what happens. I understand the distraction of sort of the muddy hoof prints, but in some ways, because the whole top of the image is rather is just the sky, in some ways it makes for a very dynamic composition, but in other ways maybe there's just too much sky there. I wonder if maybe a little bit less contrast in this area of the hoof prints, because I kind of like what the hoof prints are saying. I get a sense that these guys have been doing some stuff. They've been traveling around the beach, maybe trying to catch the dog. I don't really know what's happening there.
Even changing the perspective and the depth of field. I think if the photographer were to lower the camera, and where the camera angle is looking more up at the riders instead of at eye level, and that way, and putting the focus squarely on the riders with a shallower depth of field, so that you have that natural. So if you were to take even like a radial blur to the lower third of the image, you still have that impact that you were talking of, Steve. Because now that you said it, and this is what the great thing about having discourse on images is, and differing opinions, is you should be able to take someone else's opinion and see it and say, you know what, when you mention it like that, and when you framed it after saying so, it does. I can see the impact that I didn't see before. I think having less sharpness to the lower third, you still get that impact of seeing it, but it's not it doesn't draw your eye as much.
Yeah, it definitely the low angle. I mean, I learned that early on, that oftentimes I will sort of start low and work my way up, because I get lazy. I stand at a certain position and it's easy to just stand and shoot. It's more difficult to kind of bend down, lower down. With tilt screens, review screens, it's a little bit easier to do so, and that's part of the reason why I love them. But yeah, I often will start at a lower angle and then sort of get some help getting up again and keep shooting. You can see from the original composition, I think there's just maybe a little too much maybe on the left, at least for this particular crop. So just even by coming in and containing this scenario a little bit, it works better. But yeah, I think all those things are valid, what we talked about. At the same time, it's still a beautiful kind of an image that captures a really nice moment. And, there's a lot of pluses there, a little bit of controversy in terms of what I was saying, although you can see the horse there sort of coming to a halt. You can see this guy's hair, perhaps maybe not doing the silhouette thing, but by lightening them up a little bit, that might, sort of help the situation a little bit. But anyway, these are debates. There's no right or wrong here in terms of what we're talking about. So let's move on to another kind of evocative image. This one here, what I really love about it, of course, is the steam coming from, I haven't been to this park. I know where it is in Queens, right? Near the
Flushing.
Yeah, Flushing. But what is creating this sort of steam here? That's what I really kind of love about the image. Again, the edges of the frame. So, you've got all this going on. The light is not necessarily that interesting. The time of day you can see here looks like it's more sort of, between the middle of the day, closer to the middle of the day than it is toward the early morning or late afternoon. But what's really making the image are all these sort of figures and the steam coming across. But then, of course, you've got this kid who's right at the edge of the frame, a little awkwardly cropped. It's difficult to crop off the hand there, but these guys are sort of become kind of the focal point. But in some ways, they're not as interesting as the other stuff that's going on. So, let's just do this and see how that changes the image. In a way, it becomes something very different. It becomes something very calm and interesting, I think. Maybe come down a little up top here and just concentrate on, these guys walking in the steam. And again, the post-processing, I think, can really make a difference, but it changes the whole mood and tempo, and I think in some ways completes it. That being said, the image is different when you've got the kid on the side goofing around or reacting to the steam. What are your thoughts, Derek?
Yeah, same thing. The first thing that calls my attention is the figure, the kid on the edge. So we already addressed that. I would love to see this. And so from a critique standpoint, way too blown out. This is a situation where for effect and to really just have a lot of latitude, you would want to expose for that highlight area there. Now, I see this as, in camera, I would have underexposed it about 2 stops at least of where it's at. And you can really get some dynamic shadows there. The beauty of digital cameras as well is you have a lot more dynamic range if you wanted to get a little bit of detail back into the shadows and not just do a high key, very contrasty silhouette style. I feel like it can make it for like a really cool, mysterious shot. You have the clouds up there, but obviously we're working with a JPEG, so we can't really get to the vision that I'm seeing in post-processing here. But these are what you need to take into account again when you're taking the image. When you look at the back of your camera, whether you use the histogram or not, this is going to be my sales pitch for using the histogram or having the zebra lines on, the highlight warnings. Most systems nowadays have a highlight warning, and you'll get those zebra lines across areas that are blown out. Now, when you take an image and you see that they're across a majority of the heart of your image, you're going to say, okay, I need to bring this down a little bit. I need to bring the exposure way down.
Yeah, and if the photographer owns the raw file, chances are they have a lot more latitude at really enhancing this image and bringing out its strength. Obviously, this sculpture of the globe there is a very powerful icon. But if you actually move in and you cut out that lamppost, and then sort of figure out, what the best kind of way to crop this image is, and I'm not saying this is it, because maybe it's best to leave some of that lamppost in so that you can include these guys in the foreground.
And this, Steve, this would be another candidate for changing your angle too and getting down lower and giving that larger stature to the figures.
Yeah, working the image. Look, what I really like about this image is that all the chess pieces, as I often will call them, that are out of our control, line up really kind of nicely the way they're spread out and not overlapping. So that aspect of it, I think the moment that is captured, is very successful. But you can see there's all kinds of great images here. And, I think when you encounter a scene like this, take it and then keep working it and not thinking and not looking on the back of your camera. Trust your camera. Once you've got the exposure, you've got some latitude. And by the way, when Derek is talking about those highlight warnings, they're warning you of a JPEG, which is a fraction of the size of the raw file. So oftentimes when you see that you've kind of lost information in the highlights, they're actually there if you have the raw file and you take the highlight slider and bring it back. They are there. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great things in terms of the capture and the moment, because it's constantly changing. All these people are moving, and it's exciting, to be able to be in this situation where it's got this great potential. Maybe we even don't even care about this and just focus in on the kind of misty people in the foreground and the mood that creates, because the light is not all that interesting up top. This is kind of where the action is, and of course this is a really beautiful element to the scene. But yeah, I mean, work it. Don't stop. And we'll move on to another image that similar to the horse one, in the sense that it's a constantly changing scenario, and perhaps the elements in this photo are not moving as fast, so you have a little bit more time to create the composition. But from a compositional standpoint, I think it's rather well done. The micro composition of the person here in the blue in the area just above the grass works really well. The separation of the sheep from the sheep dog, and then the horses in the background. I do think that, again, is color really helping the image, or is it hurting it? In some ways, it might even work better in black and white. And again, the enhancement is really important. When you've got the raw materials of the image are there, maybe we can, lessen the contrast a little, bring up some detail in the very dark areas, and really work the image. From a micro composition point of view, maybe a little bit more in, again, ignoring the aspect ratio, but just even something like this, I think, can help to balance the image. And, we're not going to spend all that much time on the hundreds of images that we create, but we have an image that's a keeper and it's a good one. Let's make it as good as it can possibly be.
Boom. Nothing to add. You nailed it.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on. We've got a few other images here of these kind of vistas that we can talk about. And, these two images, I guess, maybe have more in common in terms of the light and the drama of the composition. But speaking of composition, let's maybe just start with this one, because again, we get the images from you and keep sending them in. We don't necessarily have time to look at images before the show, but when we see them, now we can kind of appreciate them. We can take the time to look. And, this is obviously a still life. There's no people in the image, but it's a very interesting, graphic, beautiful black and white with a lot of really interesting tones. And compositionally, I think, this part on the left is really kind of interesting and could be a photo unto its own. I mean, if we just came in a little bit on that, and did something. Oops. Let's see what we can do here. Just take that boat out completely. It's really kind of an interesting landscape. And in some ways, the boat is the most kind of common thing, where doesn't seem to be anything common in this take on wherever this might be. I'm not necessarily saying that that's the way to do it, but something to consider. Go ahead, Derek.
This is as close to perfection as you'll see in an image, in my opinion.
High praise.
Everything. I mean, this is high praise, but I mean, I audibly gasped when you pulled it up. We don't really.
Nice.
I don't look at the images before we critique them. I know you organize them, Steve, so you have a little bit of a a little bit of a peak, but
Mhm.
I love when that's how you should be responding to images. When you have a reaction before you really fully take in an image, that's how you know you've knocked it out of the park. Just the everything's there. The wow factor, the details, the attention to detail, the composition. To me, it looks like they're, even the post processing looks like probably some gradient was added to the sky. But when post processing is done right, you can
Mm.
be a little more heavy handed or add more of a creative element to it. And as long as it sells the image and doesn't detract from it, it's definitely it's a technique, and it's something that when you use it well, it works great. I love everything about the attention to detail in the framing here. When we talked about foreground, and it's just the right amount of foreground. If you look at the foreground here, and it's kind of like you can slice this image up into sections. And it was funny when you were cropping that, the left side, and this is like you could probably make about 5 good images out of just this one entire image here. I looked at the little barn or house, our boat house, whatever it is on the right side there, and the way there's some breathing room on the edge is just so nice. Even the content of this, it looks like this is during a drought period. It looks like that's a boathouse, and it looks like the water line is probably up where the dark meets the light. I mean, that's what it looks like to me. I don't know if this is the case, but I think there's just so much to digest here. It's beautifully done. Black and white. I don't even know what the color looks like, but black and white was a great decision here. I like the depth of field in it, everything. I even like the crop and the aspect ratio. Well done.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you talk about the post processing and you talk about, yeah, the sky is very dark, and I don't know kind of what the reality was, but the bottom line is it's very powerful and effective, and it works. Oftentimes we'll look at images, and the first thing we see is that the photographers post processing, either they went too far or not far enough, and we can critique that. But in this case, the photographer had an idea of what this image was to be, and then went to work to create that vision, and I think was very successful in that creation. My only kind of reasoning for cropping that boat out initially was that, this image is so kind of otherworldly. And then I see the boat and I see this, and okay, I understand what that is. But it's just something about, this fence. It almost looks like a mountain, kind of Ansel Adams kind of an image just on the left there. It's just really kind of beautiful, and the mystery of it. But it works, as Derek mentioned. There are a lot of photos in there, and you encounter a scene like this. The idea of working it that we're always talking about is, yeah, take this image and then maybe concentrate on other aspects of where you are, because who knows, you'll never be there again at that time when the light is such, etc. So when you have photo opportunity, and by that I mean you're a little bit excited about what's in front of you that you're about to document, start somewhere and work your way and move around and try some things, and don't peek too much, but just work the image, take a break, get back to the computer later, and enjoy the tough decisions that you're going to have, because you'd much rather have a lot of tough decisions than, oh, I guess this is the best of the worst kind of thing. All right. Well, here we have another image, beautiful black and white, kind of a silhouette of this musician in Central Park, I believe, and looks to be kind of alone, which is a little weird because there's always a lot of people there, and that's kind of nice. And then it just becomes, look, it's beautiful in the sense that, when you look at the person, you can see the guitar fret, you don't have to see them. But the question then becomes, the framing. Do we need as much up top here? And on my laptop, I'm having a hard time seeing. Maybe you guys can see it a little clearer. But perhaps maybe we can, crop this a little bit to see if we can make it a little stronger. Maybe we don't need all that stuff. Maybe we just have to find a way to bring it in and make it sing a little bit more. Here's one possibility, but what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it's the everything's off as far as the positioning for me. And I'll fully admit it. It might be because I've photographed Bethesda Terrace 1,000,001 times. I have very intimate knowledge of the location. We've done a ton of workshops there, and knowing that the composition that exists here is information that you use in critiquing. This is something that guy who plays there is always dead center. It looks like you got a nice, probably very early morning moment where there's not a million tourists there. You don't have photo shoots going on and having to work around parabolic umbrellas in your shot. I just want to take the camera and move it 5 feet to the right and center off those archways in the background, and you have such a great opportunity to have the fountain with the angel behind the man playing the whatever he's playing, whether it's the violin or whatever he's playing. There's such a great compositional opportunity here, and you can even still get that archway in the foreground and compose it, but it's never the way. There's certain times when you can fix something in a crop or with a perspective tool, and there's times when you just can't go back and reposition yourself. And this is one of those times, and it's not going to be symmetrical. No matter how we line it up, it's going to be off kilter. And that, that's a huge part of it. The other part obviously is in the exposure, where you're looking through and you have such a stark difference in contrast of what's going on in the terrace and then outside the terrace, looking through those arches in the background. And that's something where if you're going to silhouette the guy, you might as well bring it down and bring your exposure down and expose for the highlights on the other side of the archway, as that's going to create a more dynamic background and backdrop. And the guy's going to be, he's going to be underexposed either way, because there's such a difference. He's probably at least 4 or 5 stops of light darker at any given time than it is outside. So even as you see there and you start to bring it back in, some of that detail, it makes it a little more dynamic. You don't want to have to contend with compositional issues and exposure issues. One or the other, you might be able to get away with, but contending with both makes it a really hard sell.
Yeah, it's almost like it's an embarrassment of riches in terms of this particular scene. You've got, of course, the fountain in the background is its own sort of interesting, beautiful photo opportunity. But then you have this musician lonely by themselves, which is kind of interesting. And then you have all these arches, and you have the details and the texture on the outside arch, and then the shadow areas of the arches, creating those curves and so on. But when you kind of put it all together, it's almost like it's overwhelming. It's too much. And because of that, because you haven't necessarily curated the composition as best you could, you end up with an image that's been somehow diluted, because you've got everything in there. You've got all the arches, you've got the fountain, you've got the musician, you've got the silhouette, and you've got the textures of you kind of have to, again, working it will allow you to kind of move in and just concentrate on the musician, forget the arches, and see what you can do with that silhouetted. Come back and do this. And then ultimately, you will probably have a stronger image ultimately by working it, especially in a situation like this, where it looks like maybe there's a little time to be able to focus without a lot of other people being there. That all being said, it's still really kind of nice to see the textures and the architecture and the lonely guy there, but then the fountain is there. And in the end, it's just a little bit too much. And because of that, I think the strength of the image has been diluted a little. Does that make sense, Derek?
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's continue on. And all right, well, let's take a look at these next few images, because I think in here, we have a lot of energy, a lot of movements. And, maybe I'll just take this one out for just a second. And if you see these four images together, obviously very different images, very different places. But one of the commonalities I think that all these images have is this sort of energy and movement in terms of, when the eye looks, we're just sort of swept around the frame, caught up with the geography and the lines and the curves and all those kinds of things. And I think, in some ways, you can look at, these two images, and maybe they complement each other. The one on the right with the green, I don't really know what it is. And this one looks like, obviously somewhere in the Sahara or a desert. Very simple, light and shadow and lines. But there's an energy and movement that is keeping me interested, I think, even in the simplicity of this image here when we see it. Did you want to talk in general terms before we get into the specifics, Derek?
Well, only just to say that again, you prove every week how sequencing can be so important, and you can take images that on their own wouldn't stand as strong as with the right pairing. So take notes, people.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, in some ways that becomes the next step where 2 + 2 = 6. And, this isn't science. And as we've often said, art is definitely not a democracy, and everyone's got their opinions when it comes to images, but the strong images rise to the top. And looking at these two paired off, I think individually they're pretty dynamic and strong. Together, maybe they're even stronger, although they're very different images. This one reminded me of a series that a Japanese photographer did. I think he called it the spider strategy, if you wanted to Google that, because in the very modern Japan, there's also a lot of these kinds of poles with wires on them. And the photographer went out and just did a whole series of images of these poles and created these really interesting dynamic composition and put them together in this book, which aptly named the spider strategy, and it worked really well. In looking at this one now, I'm seeing that, there's more here than what is real. And it looks as though there's some kind of weird technique, but it works. I mean, I don't know what's happening in the background there or how the photographer has sandwiched maybe images together. But it's, to me, interesting and kind of mission accomplished. I think it works. There's also kind of a selective color thing happening, the blue, black and white of the pole, and then whatever's happening in the background. It almost looks like a solarization. If you guys remember that, ask your grandparents what that was in the darkroom. What do you think of something like this, Derek?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm going to add a little historical context here because I always think that can add to our images and the impact of them. How many times have we tried to remove power lines from an image, whether in post-processing or in framing? And we're like, this would be so great if there wasn't all these obnoxious power lines in front of it. 30 years from now, we may not have power lines. I kind of think of power lines as the white iPhone cords, or the phone booths. Exactly. And it's now when we come across a working telephone booth, or a standalone public telephone, public payphone, you take a picture of it because it's a relic. And I think images like this really, there's historical context to it. This is done in a more creative, artistic way, which I applaud. And it's something that you can use it as a wall piece. This is something that it's simple, it's recognizable, but at the same time, the lines form art. It's almost like organized chaos. And I think there's multiple uses. And anytime you have a variable of uses or ways you can look at an image, it makes it only a stronger image. I could see this as a stock photo or something, like I said, like wall art even. But yeah, it's nicely seen, nicely captured. It's something that a lot of people would look at and If you have OCD, it might drive you crazy, or it might give you anxiety looking up at it. But for those that are able to look up and see art out of this, I think that's an incredibly well seen eye.
Yeah. And you notice we're not really talking about anything technical. We're not talking about cropping it in any way. We're really just talking about the image itself, which again, I think that's a mission accomplished. This one's kind of interesting. Oh, they're all birds. I guess we're looking at the butts of the pigeons, and we got the one outcast, or maybe it's the leader. I don't know. But it's obviously very dramatic in terms of the composition. It's also kind of funny, and the kind of the treatment, I think, is very effective in terms of really the only color in there is the blue, and the rest is all kind of gray. Some of the most effective color images are very monochromatic, not to the point of selective color where we have maybe one color and then everything else is monochrome, but it's a very monochromatic image that I think works in this instance and brings attention. And I think the photographer, the moment is really important, because you don't see any face here. They're all in the same position. And then, this guy just tilted a little, so you can definitely see his face. And I think it was well composed.
Yeah, I agree. I think this reminds me of a image that I would see from. There's a photographer that I follow on Instagram, Jose Ruiz Gonzalez. His Instagram is Casa Ruiz. I'll drop it in the chat there if anybody wants to check his work out. But it's very interesting compositions, and just sees the world in a different way, and even somewhat like the way he edits the images to work. It's interesting, and I like the placement here. For me, it's the little things. It's the one bird whose tail is out and facing the other way, and the other pigeon down on the left, and little things like that the fact that there's no clouds behind that bird right there. It's the little details that really sell it. Even the birds on the line across the top.
Yeah.
The only
Yeah.
part where clouds are reaching in is in the bottom. You have that whole
That's
line.
Right. Exactly.
And this is something where Jose Ruiz Gonzalez would probably pull out the brush and make it so that entire line of pigeons is on a blue backdrop. But even to keep it just like this, and how this image was seen, again, it's about seeing a great moment and being able to execute. This is one that's very, very well done. I even like there's the dynamic range, where a lot of people would have this and have the birds silhouetted, or they would somehow, I'd see this shot attempted a lot, and they botch the post-processing, and you get the haloing around the birds. I think this is very nicely done.
Yeah. And again, the idea of working it, like you imagine the photographers saw the possibility of this, and then it's just simply a matter of moving into position so that, yes, you can, keep him in the blue, and then coincidentally, or maybe even just wait for the clouds are always moving. So as the clouds move, and patience is rewarded in photography, you have all these birds, not in the clouds and just a little bit down there, which is not hurting anything. So yeah, I think there's a lot to appreciate, as a photographer in this image. And then just as purely as a viewer, I think it's aesthetically wonderful. And the message and humor behind it, I think is also there as well. So, very well done. And then we have an image like this, which, similar to the desert scene, is really just about sort of form and color, which I think, can be very interesting. Sometimes, though, it's the beginning of something. It's the beginning of a series, and, a picture on its own, may have limited ability to really completely captivate your audience. But I don't really know even what this is. I mean, I get a sense that it's a living plant of some sort, but the way it has been captured or whatever these reflections are, it doesn't really matter. It's all about sort of the movement. And I get a sense that these are kind of like eels in the water or snakes. And there's movement going on, and there's something really almost menacing about it. It's kind of interesting in that way.
Yes, and before I opine on this, I'll just let you know we're at our 4-minute warning, so
Oh, wow.
we'll wrap up on this set right here. But
Okay.
one interesting thing about this, Steve, that stands out for me is you have no idea of scaling looking at
Mhm.
this image. You don't know if this is a giant installation that's the size of a billboard, or if it's something smaller that is like a small glass piece that's can sit on a desk. It's just kind of interesting in that way. I like it. I don't know what it is about it. I like it. It's simple. I bring this conversation up, and I had brought it up earlier. I bring it up all the time about having things in your image that when you don't know what it is, or when it draws curiosity, there's good curiosity and there's bad curiosity. There's curiosity that takes away from the strength of the image. And then there's curiosity that plays into the power of the image. And I think that's one such case here where I want to know what it is. I want to know more about it. At the end of the day, do I care enough what it is to be distracted by the fact that I don't know what it is? No, I think it just makes it more intriguing. And there's a nice flow here. It's composed nicely. Even the imperfections in whatever it is that's going on based on what's being given off by whatever this is. It's like I can't really speak in anything. It's just a whole lot of subjective opinions on it, but I like it. And at the end of the day, sometimes that's all that matters. This is a piece that I can see hanging up on a wall, on a giant print above someone's couch. And I think it would be a beautiful addition.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think pictures that ask questions are often more evocative and interesting. And, we have a similar scenario here, but we kind of know what this is. And in some
Mhm.
ways, knowing what it is, having seen this kind of image before, makes it, yeah, at least for me, a little less interesting than something like this, which arguably technically is maybe not as strong, even compositionally perhaps is not as necessarily well thought out of. Although in this one, I'd almost want to see a little bit more up on the top here, and maybe a little bit, we can lose a little on the bottom, because this bright area here, and this is really kind of interesting. And then, the idea of doing a series or going through your Lightroom catalog and finding these kinds of images and putting them together into something can be very interesting. And, who's to say you couldn't, frame two images together as one? You create something new by taking two images, putting them together either up and down or side by side. And that is the new piece, because together they say something different or something stronger than they would kind of on their own. But yeah, I think these four examples here, are worth talking about. And in the end, as critiquers, I don't know if that's a noun, but we all have our personal preference in terms of the kind of images we like to pursue. But in the end, they all end up as two-dimensional representations of something. And a lot of the same rules apply, whether they're, landscapes or sort of the green thing that we don't know what it is, or the spider strategies or the birds, or even a portrait. It's what they're communicating. And I think even though we may not be an expert on all areas and all genres, the commonality is that we recognize what a strong image is. And, Derek can appreciate this image as he can a more, street image, one that maybe he would create, or a portrait, and so on and so forth. So I'll kind of end there on that, and I'll let Derek finish up.
Yeah, I think everything you said is valid. I'll add one thing just on the sand dunes there. Keep in mind on something like this, where the littlest things in the bottom right, you have the imperfections or the footprints. Same thing with the footprints right about top third, a little bit right of center there. All that stuff, we know what it is, but it still draws our eye. And on something like this, I think I would like to see a little more contrast. And it might not be the look you're going for, but that's what we're here to do, is give our opinion. A little more contrast to add a little bit more depth. And that depth, I think, adds interest to the image. We know what it is, but we want to see that idea in our mind. It's almost like the the Mandela effect. It's like we have this idea of what dunes should look like, and in our mind they're always very high contrast, and then you go out there and you see them and you're like, oh no, it's not how they look in person unless you have the right light, and then they're even greatly edited in most pictures. But it's like that for a reason. I think it sells the image more. But yeah, everything else you said, Steve, just hits the nail on the head. And we're here to make everybody better photographers, and not just you all who are submitting, but ourselves as well. Steve started the show with it, and it's something that, looking at these images, we look at them and we use it when we go out and we take images. And the goal is to make everybody a better photographer and to help everybody see images differently. And I think the more that we do that, and the more we're able to have discourse about images, it only makes for stronger bodies of work down the road. So I want to thank Steve once again, and Lassie for hosting. Steve, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, just it's always a pleasure to look at these images and to hear your perspective, Derek. And yeah, we'll just keep on going. Please keep submitting the images. And obviously we haven't gotten to everyone yet, but we will continue and do this as long as the people demand it. And we will continue to do this because, again, all levels can, I think, benefit from a critique, and not only the critique on your own photos, but by watching others and sort of seeing what they have done or are doing. We can be inspired and go out and emulate and ultimately make them our own way of capturing the world.
Definitely. Well, I'll double down on that. And again, thanks Steve and Lassie for sponsoring this wonderful series of critiques, but also to all of you guys out there. We don't have any critiques if you guys don't submit. So huge thank you. We have some of the best fans and viewers out there in the industry. You guys always keep us on our toes and send us a ton of great commentary to go along with wonderful images. So thank you guys for making this possible. And thank you for tuning in to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. I'll leave it right there for now. We'll catch y'all next time.
See you later, guys.